slate. Again, we had a big old pile of games on Sunday. Not much going on Monday. Is this real life? It is I, Dr. Strange, here to discuss with you this evening's contests. Shout out to a couple of our big winners in the last week. I've had multiple six-digit winners in the last 5 days, which is always nice. And two different people contacted me saying they had come into a big winning and had offered to share the cheddar, which is very kind. And in both instances, I happily redirected those people towards charity. I mentioned this because it's really a win-win. But should you be so lucky, let's do some good out there. Tonight's slate is most interesting for me because of how polarized I am on some of the plays versus other people, and really how much I prefer some of the teams versus the other teams. Now, that's obviously the case whenever we talk about fantasy basketball. There's going to be certain teams we look at some night and be super excited to see them perform, and other teams that, for obvious reasons, we're going to be a little less excited about. I'm checking right now. Yeah, there we go. The tweet actually went out. I don't need to dig it up. Josh Engelman back from vacation. Not on the show today, you may have noticed. If you were here for Josh, I apologize. It is just me, an older, sweatier, far less healthy version. But nonetheless, hopefully able to guide you into some cheddar this evening. They say one of the flaws with modern news, TV, or debate is that regardless of the merit of ideas, everything ends up being presented as a 50-50 option. You put one guy up there who believes in universal equality and another guy up there who thinks that an entire race should be driven into the sea, and you're giving a perhaps somewhat unreasonable 50-50 view of those two options. And I almost, you may be thinking, what in the hell does this have to do with basketball? And that's probably pretty normal, but I bring it up because on slates like this, frequently you will see people go through and we'll break down 5 games or 10 teams and end up not enough focusing, not just by time, but by a specific emphasis on the teams we really want to play. So, there are 10 teams on tonight's slate. I really want to play guys on 4 of them. And it's even close to 3, but I would like, 85% of my players in my lineups to come from the Hornets, the Knicks, the Celtics, and the Clippers. I really want to play guys on those 4 teams. The other 6 teams I am mildly ambivalent to outright hateful towards. And I think it's necessary to sort of point that out at the beginning. If you're looking at, say, DraftKings, where you got, 8 guys in a lineup, or say FanDuel, where you have 9, Yahoo is 8, I'm not shocked if everybody but one person comes out of those games. I'm not shocked if everybody comes out of those games. I'm pretty surprised if there's 3 or more players in the winning lineup out of the Pacers and the Warriors, who obviously seemed likely, the ugly Memphis and Denver game, a likely hatched up, Brooklyn team, which people seem to have a lot of interest in today, which there's a couple players I obviously don't hate, and we'll get into that, but going into on the road against Brooklyn, also on the front end of back-to-back for the Nets, who rank number 1 in my ability to F up your night because they're on a back-to-back. The Clippers and the Knicks played yesterday, if you're curious. So Clippers and the Knicks on the backside, Nets on the front side. That sounds kinky. Let's go ahead and talk about these games for a little bit. Again, I am alone, so those of you who have been so kind in the past to keep me informed with news as it breaks, I am most happily kind again for your able assistance. The Warriors were sort of an interesting case for me this evening. I'm lucky to have a number of people, you know who you are, who are kind enough to talk with me about basketball all day and run some ideas by. I like to think I provide some decent advice, but certainly whatever I give is buoyed by the fact that I have a number of friends and colleagues who are nice enough to bounce ideas around with me for a few hours a day via chat. And thank you for your help. So, talking about the Warriors, we have Draymond obviously out, Jerebko out. I presumed Kevon Looney was going to be starting, and I would have been fairly tepid on that anyway. But it turns out Jordan Bell is going to be starting. The price all the way down to $3,000 on DraftKings makes that a slightly more acceptable play for me. I have my hair under 20 minutes. I still have 19 minutes for Jordan Bell. I think it's a situation where you're looking at something like 19 minutes and 16 and a half fantasy points. But he's a little more disposed to a significant upside per minute than Kevon Looney. but really would be sort of just a cash play for me if that price absolutely worked in there. But you could run him out there in a GPP and hope you got 24. But it was interesting today because of the sheer number of contrasting arguments I heard about the Golden State Warriors from my various friends. So I got a lot of, Draymond's going to be out. Steph is going to be more heavily involved in running the offense, which is not the most unreasonable immediate conclusion to come to, because Draymond has been brilliantly distributing the ball this year. He had multiple double-digit assist games in a row earlier this year, has always sort of played that role, and it largely affects the rotation. But for me, you're also looking at a distinct loss of efficiency in the lineup for when you go having Draymond, who is a brilliant piece to have on the floor for your offense, to Jordan Bell, who's not going to do nearly as much, being kind. So, what gains are gotten there from, him having an increased role, I think come down from being less efficient. And again, talking about all these Warriors, we should remember they're going into Indiana, whereas they are still favored by 8 points or so. But this is an elite defense. This is, in the conversation of the 3 or 4 teams you really don't want to see across the ball. And when you take Draymond out, you are taking out the guy who really occupies the least of the offensive motion in this offense. Now, you still have Clay and Stephen Durant, obviously, and now DeMarcus Cousins out there. So for that reason, a lot of the stats are, well, without Draymond, this tends to happen. Well, yeah, but now it's without Draymond with Cousins, whereas all the other stuff you're showing me was without Draymond and with, Damian Jones in there at center, or Zaza, or whomever, depending on how back we're pushing this sample. I got Steph Curry averages like 6 fantasy points less a game this year when Draymond is out, as opposed to Kevin Durant in, I think, 5 games. But Kevin Durant averages like 8 fantasy points a game more with Draymond Green out in 14 games. And I usually give that person a second if they don't figure it out. I go, yeah, so again, let's do that math together. There's 5 games in which Steph played and Draymond was out, and 14 games where Durant played and Draymond was out. So, yeah, that split has a lot to do with Durant for the fact that Steph was out for 9 of those goddamn games, which is a little bit more relevant than whether or not Draymond is out. And we, of course, all know this for just having played Durant without Steph for a couple years. So, I guess this sort of was long way around of a cautionary tale of looking at a split or a stat or a head-to-head where this guy is good against this guy and just being like, oh, clearly that's a good situation. There are always multiple mitigating factors, and sometimes there's a couple and your stat will still be somewhat valid, and sometimes there's a few more than that and your stat is sort of irrelevant, and then there's times where your stat is legitimately harming you because it simply doesn't apply to the situation you are attempting to apply it to. So, again, looking at this matchup, I will state again for the sake of redundancy because it's important, this is not a great matchup, and I don't look at this as suddenly a brilliant situation for Curry or Clay or Durant or Cousins or Bell or Looney or whomever else you want to apply this to. They all have some degree of appeal for me in tournaments. Let's start with DeMarcus Cousins. He is actually the person I probably project to see the largest increase in viability in this matchup due to the fact that I like his individual matchup. He will see lots of Miles Turner, and for several years through Sacramento and through New Orleans, really did beat the living piss out of Miles Turner, and I wouldn't expect that to change significantly here. Plus the fact that without Draymond, things are going to bog down a little bit. I think things will run a little bit less clearly. You'll see a little more half-court offense. Indiana's already going to lead you that way a little bit. Cousins would have been the guy I liked the most. The thing is, he's way more popular than he should be, and he's way more expensive than he should be. I was giving what I thought was a somewhat generous estimate of 1.5 fantasy points a minute for DeMarcus Cousins when he came back. And he exceeded that in his first game, where they had basically best matchup in the NBA against the Clippers, and he played 15 minutes and had 30 fantasy points. And since then, he's been, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. Let's go ahead and gussy him all the way back up to 1.5 here, which is a little bit more than I project. And let's go ahead and bump his projected minutes up to 25. That's 37.5 fantasy points. That'd be fine. But you need him to, really excel. And unlike a lot of the other options we're looking at that cost $7,000, the odds of getting like 50 out of him Someone's going to have to go really, really squirrely. And there are a lot of other guys who just carry with them a gigantic tournament-winning upside around that price range. If you want to play Montrezl Harrell has a 50-point game this year against the Hawks, and the only other time he's played. You want to play Lou Williams? He can certainly do it for you at about the exact same price. There's just other guys around that tag who I think carry a larger upside, and Cousins, presumably still limited minutes, really do sort of step on him a little bit. So he is the player who, with Draymond out, I would immediately give the most appeal to. I had some interesting Durant conversations where someone was like, he's lucky he gets guarded by Bojan, and the next guy was like, Bojan is an excellent defender who I think can handle Durant, and 2/3 of those two sentences are absolutely wrong. It does not surprise me if they swap Thad Young over onto Durant for a little bit, or quite an extended period of time, because Jordan Bell isn't someone we really need to worry about. But regardless, I think what you're hoping for here is that either Steph or Durant go into more of a bully ball isolation game and simply win their individual matchups, and there's no reason to think that either or both of those things aren't possible. But long story short, despite the loss of Draymond, Sumner is starting. I thought Edmund Sumner not get the start. That's very, very interesting. I presume he is the minimum price. That came in nicely in timing, because we'll talk about the Pacers in a second. I like Edmund Sumner. We talked about him a lot in Summer League. I think he missed an entire year with, I want to say it was an ACL, but so he's drafted a couple of years back. But I like Edmund Sumner's game. I don't think he's all that in a bag of chips. $3,000 on DK, I'm sure. But there's just other value today that I project for 30 fantasy points. I will gently project Edmund Sumner for, let's see, Nate. I'll guess Edmund Sumner sees 23 minutes. I'll give him 17 fantasy points. It'll be something like that. I don't think there is a ton to see there. But we may talk about that a little more in a minute. But this ends up being still not a great spot for Curry and Durant and Thompson and Cousins for me. I explained Cousins extensively. Clay, again, against tougher defenses, I am often a little bit more worried about. Removing Draymond is going to affect the ball movement a little bit more, and as seen in your Clay ceiling games, we frequently have those crazy games where he makes 12 three-pointers and only dribbles the ball 7 times. He is not great at creating his own shot in the absence of one of their primary facilitators, plus a difficult defensive matchup makes it less likely, not impossible, but less likely for me to believe he gets set up that many times that well. The absence of that factor makes it less likely for me that I get my 40 real point Klay Thompson mega game here, so disinclined towards Clay. He's never going to be out of play. But I would rather play Cousins or Steph or Durant. Between Steph or Durant, I will hesitantly pick Steph Curry here. Slightly better success against this system. Although, again, it is worth pointing out, I've had other people talk about the matchup. These two teams played twice last year. Durant played one of them. Steph played neither. And they played at the very beginning of the year before that. So literally, Steph has not been on the court against a Pacer since 2016. So again, the Warriors, one of the teams in which it's not that much of a system, with the exception of how it works down low with finally having an active center, a center who can shoot 3-pointers, which didn't exist there for 4 years. But I will generally go with Steph over Durant. I think they're both fine tournament plays. I am not concerned if I have no one from this game in my lineup. That is my take on that. Let us go over and look at the Pacers. We have Darren Collison with price, I think, on DraftKings at $5,900. It's still fairly appealing for me now that we've removed both Tyreke Evans and, of course, Victor Oladipo from the equation there. We will have Edmund Sumner come in and start at the 2, so they'll keep their normal remaining starters of Bogdanovich, Young, and Turner at the 3, 4, and 5. Collison at $5,900 makes a fair bit of sense to me. Those other guys out, I do like a little bit more usage. I do like him to probably get to double-digit assists. There's a number of ways he can get on top of that. Regarding the other guys, my next guy I would want to play would probably be the Deuce. I would probably run Thaddeus Young out there. Again, especially DK at $5,700. He makes an interesting tournament play for me. This, again, a team where if I don't have anyone, I'm not at all concerned. If I'm looking for a guy to play in cash, it would probably only be Darren Collison on DK for me. You could make an argument for Thad Young. In tournaments, I would probably rank them. You can play Sumner, I suppose. I would rather play Jordan Bell than Sumner. Sumner has a better chance of giving you literally 4 fantasy points. Bell is going to grab a few rebounds and do a few other things in this game. So I would rather play Jordan Bell than Edmund Sumner if I'm looking at either of the mega punts that now exist from this game. In tournaments, I would probably rank them Collison, Thad, Turner, Bojan, Corey Joseph, Sabonis, I think, in that order. Yeah, and don't forget, Doug McDermott is never the answer. It's just never the answer. I had someone, I said the same thing about Wayne Ellington was starting for a game the other day. And someone was like, don't you like Wayne Ellington? That guy can shoot. I'm like, yeah, but that's all he can do. Like, you can play him, and at minimum price, he's going to need to make, like, 6 3-pointers to get you there. And I think his final line was 19 points and a rebound. Doug McDermott, final line in a similar game would be 19 points and 2 rebounds, because he plays down a little bit more and the ball lands in his hands once in a while. Anyhow, that game, which, again, I'm not super excited about. Want to stack it up? Could certainly stay close. But, again, I like having one of the Golden State mega guys in hopes he gets there. Something else. Let's go ahead and move ahead and talk about the Knicks and Charlotte, obviously. Game we have a lot of interest in. We got confirmation that Trey Burke will be starting with both Emmanuel Mudiay and Frank Ntilikina out, and that seems to be where we should start talking. He is objectively a good play. He is generally a very good fantasy point producer. Any talk on the Indiana Wings? I thought I just did. Sumner, I mean, who are your wings? Sumner and Bojan? Is that what we're discussing? You could play Bojan in a tournament. I have him ranked as my 4th best tournament play on that team after Miles and Thad and Collison. I don't know. There are simply other players at either cheaper prices or better spots or better pace. There's just something better from most of the other players. So I would rather play Tim Hardaway, for example, from this game we're about to get into over Bojan for just a few $100s more. But Trey Burke is basically a fantasy point per minute guy. He has shown over the years, when given the opportunity, that the chance to put up 50-point games. Did it for an embarrassing large quantity of last spring, where I kept being like, look, Trey Burke is not this good, and then he'd go out and put up 40, and I'd be like, he is not this good, and he'd go out and put up 45, and I'd be like, there's no way Trey Burke is going to have 3 good games in a row, and they'd go out and have another good game. Sorry, I'm still bruised from that one, but I think the most likelihood for him here, just due to the fact that they are really obviously shorthanded in the backcourt, is that you do get 32 minutes out of him. And in this matchup, it's hard not to project him for 33, 34 fantasy points in that time, and for a very nominal price. I certainly could not argue with almost any amount of exposure to him. Now, he's also going to be popular as balls for exactly that reason, because while the fantasy public occasionally challenge, they are not so bad at simple long division, and they know that minutes equal money. So, again, I go through the day and I generally have, I'm tinkering with lineups, and I have a cash and a tournament lineup on each of the 3 main sites. Right now I have Trey Burke in on DraftKings, I have Trey Burke in on Yahoo. I don't happen to have him in on FanDuel. On FanDuel I have a construction that I like a little bit more that has Tim Hardaway in there, and if you don't play Trey Burke, I think it's important to play Kevin Knox or Tim Hardaway, one of those 2 guys, or Alonzo Trier. One of those 3 guys would have to have a pretty good game in the event for Trey Burke not to have one. If you're looking for reasons not to play Trey Burke, just because there are no other point guards doesn't mean that they need to give him as many minutes as they should. If you look at the last game the Knicks played, actually, Ntilikina played, I think, about 15 minutes before he went out with injury, and Trey Burke still only played, I want to say, 25 minutes, something like that. 23 minutes for Trey Burke in the last game, even though Ntilikina went out after 15. So those are your standard sort of point guards on this team. You get 20 minutes out of Alonzo Trier. You get 26 minutes out of Damian Johnson. Now, this is a good matchup. There's a number of guys on the slate who are guys who, when they get it going, usually get a chance to run that string out. And he's one of them. And I think the most likely conclusion, like 2/3 of the time, is that he's very, very good. But if he is literally going to be 80-something% owned, for example, on FanDuel at almost the exact same price, you can play Terry Rozier and Pat Beverly. And I'm a pretty big fan of that. We right now have him as 87% on DraftKings. That is not right for Trey Burke ever. That is not right for anyone playing under Fizdale ever. No. Like, I like Trey Burke. It's a good spot. If 87% is remotely correct, I would be looking to find a way to go elsewhere. I don't know about, playing none, but there are ways it cannot work out. And one of them is the minutes can be limited. When we're looking at yesterday's slate, yesterday was a very, very good day. Obviously, we had a 6-digit winner, a couple 5-digit winners, and I took a pretty big stand on Elie Okobo, saying that, earlier in the year I sort of had a segment where, like, here is the piece of the chalk most likely to fail. And I singled out Okobo by making the statement that, unlike when Melton is out there, and due to the way they treat him at the close of games and Kokoskov's relationship with him, he's going to play his 30 minutes, almost certainly. I think there's a real chance that Okobo gets his minutes, caught really hard here, and you end up getting like 20 minutes out of him, and that's exactly what happened. That's not as likely with Burke, but it's still more likely than, for example, in the previous Melton scenario earlier in the year when the rosters were similar. I'm not shocked if I see 25 minutes out of Trey Burke here. I don't think it's likely. I'd say he gets to 30 minutes 65% of the time and gets to at least 27 minutes 85% of the time. But if I randomly see 22, 24 minutes out of Trey Burke, I'm not flabbergasted in this situation. And when you have other guys in spots I really like, Terry Rozier without Kyrie Irving and Pat Beverly for $100 more in the same spot against the Hawks, where he's getting more guaranteed time and usage, and FanDuel scoring, which helps with his steals upside, etc. I'll use that as an example to move away if the ownership is anywhere near there. So, again, it's a personal risk tolerance issue. It's how likely you're going to correlate it with other plays in that game, but I'm fine with moving away with Trey Burke. It doesn't have to succeed. But he is objectively priced way, way too cheap. He should cost $6,000 or something for this spot, and he does not. The most likely scenario is he scores into the 30s, and obviously for something, that's really good. So you have to decide what you're going to do with that bit of news. Tim Hardaway was great last game and has fallen back into getting really significant minutes and really significant usage after a while where he had fallen down into repeatedly getting 25 minutes, 28 minutes. Last 3 games, 35, 39, 31 minutes, and even the 31 in the last game was reduced a little bit by foul trouble. Shots, 14-16, 14-16 each of the last 3 games. Those other guards being out, it would be hard to imagine that this would be a spot in which he would be limited. 2 games earlier this year was pretty good. 1 game against the Hornets, and awful in another one in which I really like him. Certainly that's not terribly relevant, but earlier this year he had a couple hot streaks and his price would get up to $7,000 and change, and I'd say pretty clearly, okay, that's tough for him to justify, just because you need to pull into some steals and some blocks, and he can just be a shoot only guy. But especially if you don't have Trey Burke, I think there's plenty of upside with Tim Hardaway. I would rather play Tim Hardaway than Klay Thompson, for example. I kind of like Kevin Knox here for a couple of reasons. But that price has come down. $5,300 on FanDuel, $5,400 on DK is actually hardest at price barely on Yahoo. I don't hate him here. This is a good spot for him. He did drop a 50 burger in one of those earlier 2 games against Charlotte. He's looked absolutely terrible. But again, if you don't have Burke, a guy I'd like to take a shot at, and I don't mind if you have him with Burke, certainly, at their really, really low prices each. So I'm not playing Lance Thomas. But of the starting guys, probably my favorite is Hardaway to run out in tournaments after Burke. And then I would play Knox over Vonleh. And I like Noah Vonleh quite a bit. But he and Burke sort of have the same bugaboo, which is they may irrationally and for no good reason have their minutes reduced. Last game, again, happened to Noah Vonleh, where he was perfectly healthy and rolling along and doing just fine. Well, he wasn't doing just fine. He wasn't having his best game. But just got 25 minutes, I think. Yeah. Last game, 3 fouls, which is very few for him. Played 25 minutes. There is a real chance he plays 30-plus minutes, but there's a real chance that he just sort of irrationally gets 25 minutes again. He's still perfectly fairly priced, but I would rather take Knox at much, much lower ownership and actually what I consider to be sort of similar upside. Trier is playable, again, priced much better on Yahoo than the other 2 sites. I would rather play Knox than Trier when given that option. Again, Knox in the last game played very, very poorly, and they pulled him out, and he only played 22, 23 minutes. I actually like him more for that reason. It's going to depress his ownership down to some very nice single-digit number. You got 30 minutes of Mario Hezonja in the last game. It wouldn't shock me to see 0, 10, 20, or 30 out of him. Again, this team is really difficult to project, but the upside is nice for some of these guys in these spots. I would have Dotson after all the other guys I just discussed, but not out of play. I would have him ahead of Lance Thomas, actually. And I don't mind Mitchell Robinson. There's a couple centers from this game I like, and one is Mitch Robinson on DK, where he's 4,100, and Yahoo is the flat minimum. He's $10, and Yahoo, you're getting 3 points a block. He is an absolute block monster. He's averaging, like, I don't know, 5 blocks per 36. I haven't actually looked this up. Since returning from injury, his blocks were 1 in 10 minutes, 2 in 15 minutes, 3 in 18 minutes, 4 in 16 minutes, and 2 in 22 minutes. That's 12 blocked shots in 70 minutes or so. So it's like 6 block shots. And this is actually a fine environment to possibly get some more. Minimum price on Yahoo, yeah, I like that. Went up to 23 minutes last game. I don't think that's most likely. I think most likely is you get something like 30 for Vonleh, 18 for Robinson. But even in 18 minutes, you can obviously crush $10 on Yahoo. And certainly gets close for 41 on DK. On DK, I would actually rather run Bismack Biyombo, and I kind of like Bismack Biyombo in tournaments. Last game was disappointing, but he still is a guy who carries a lot of upside, and he's sitting at $4,200, and the matchup with the Knicks is super sexy. Again, last game against Milwaukee, they go super small. Guarding Brolo is not something that's going to be a lot of fun for him. His time was understandably limited, played 16 minutes. 3 games before that, 27, 24, 29 minutes, 43, 29, 25 fantasy points. 43 feels really good if you happen to get that. That's what came against the Suns, which is not an incredibly different matchup than this one. But 29 against Indiana, 25 against Memphis. This is the Knicks. Like, if he starts and gets rolling and gets 24 minutes, I'd project him for near 30 fantasy points. There's obviously a downside there. Maybe Willie gets some revenge going. Maybe they go super small, which is obviously a real possibility here. You get more time with Marvin or MKG at the 5. But I like $4,200 Biyombo in tournaments quite a bit, and 12 on Yahoo. I think I like Mitch at 10 there more. I like Biyombo at 42 more on DK, but I'm not surprised if you see 27 minutes and 38 fantasy points out of him. It's an outstanding matchup. And if you go back earlier this year and look at the 2 previous games with the Hornets, Cody Zeller was in for both of those, and he also, not an offensive monster, had like 35 and 45 fantasy points, I want to think, in those 2 games. So yeah, including one with Vonleh starting at center, come to think of it. So yeah, I like him a fair amount. Other than that, on the Hornets, I'm going to skip the rest of the Hornets. That's how excited I am about BB there, B squared Bismack, that I was going to skip the rest of the team. Kemba is your sort of obviously good play, chalk play. Dealing with, I think it's a neck strain. I'm not terribly concerned about that. The price is obviously up. But projecting him for around 45 fantasy points, no reason you can't see a ceiling beyond that. Matchup is great. It's the most obvious place to go. Not unlike Trey Burke, which is kind of funny that we're using the same rules for a guy at 4K and a guy at 9K. If you don't have him, I really like taking one of the other pieces for some obvious leverage off a chalk guy. If you don't have Kemba, I think the first guy and most logical guy to go to, this is ignoring Bismack because that's just sort of random and so cheap it just doesn't matter, and Bismack's production isn't going to come from any sort of organized offensive role. But I like Jeremy Lamb, 5,900, 5,600. Matchup is very good. That'd be my first place to go. Second place would actually be Nick Batum. Has been a little more aggressive, looked a little better recently. Matchup is great, and everyone can do well here. I actually recall, I'm going to pull down one of the boxes that I was looking at before. We had, I think, a game earlier this year where literally all the Charlotte starters were good in a game with the Knicks. I'll see if I can get it, but I have very little aversion to playing any number of these guys. The Knicks are really that bad. Some of these games we are talking about from earlier this year were, monumentally high-scoring games. My computer apparently is going to take its time with this request. Sometimes you just ask too much. Hey, we might get it to work. Don't download in the middle of a stream. Kemba 16% on FanDuel. Yeah, that's about right, just because the value is so good. There are 3 $4,500 point guards on FanDuel who I project for I think I have Pat Beverly a hair under, but I have both Rozier and Burke for over 30 fantasy points. They cost 4,500. It's really hard to go hunting for a guy who costs $9,000, and I project to score 45 fantasy points. So if you look at the second time these two teams played this year, Kemba was, I guess, the worst of the players. He had 43. Batum had 41. Lamb had 36. Marvin had 34. Cody Zeller had 48. So that just being a way of saying, yeah, I'm not too worried if I have 3 Hornets in my lineup. Let's do a quick news check. 53 Twitter notifications. Okay, not going to have time to read that while we're on the show alone. If I was to go with one of the bench guys, it would be MKG for me. Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, if I wanted to go to one of the bench guys here. But again, this is a team that I'm really excited to have a piece of. Let's talk about Nets and Celtics. Again, for the ownership, I like playing Terry Rozier, where he ends up being about the same price as Trey Burke. It is a matchup against the Nets that we're certainly not overly worried about. The pace isn't great, but certainly a matchup in which point guards can do some damage when necessary, and again, he's just way too cheap. It ends up being site dependent. Yahoo, he's still $21 or something. That's a bit of a kick in the nuts. That's the most proportionally. 5,300 on DK, certainly very much in play. It is tough in the world of Pat Beverly and Trey Burke, etc., but certainly shouldn't be out of play for you. And then FanDuel, again, they're all priced at around $4,500. Why am I speaking in staccato? I don't know. I occasionally feel the need to bust a rhyme, and freestyle rap, not very appropriate for this show format, so I just take my flow, turn it into, I got nothing. Sometimes when I freestyle, I lose confidence. So the Nets, who would you pair Kemba with on FanDuel if you run it back with THJ? Probably one of the cheap guys. It is very unlikely that the best lineup tonight doesn't have at least one of Trey Burke, Pat Beverly, or Terry Rozier in it on FanDuel. It's possible if you get, 62 out of Kemba and 70 out of Steph, well, then it wouldn't be that, but generally you're going to want one of those guys who costs mid-4s, and we have projected for around 30 fantasy points. Let's see, the Nets are the walking wounded. Joe Harris is going to play. I think Treveon Graham is out. Rondé is going to play. Dudley, Crabbe, and Dinwiddie are all out, I think. Let me make sure I'm getting that right. Not that I want many of these guys, but I think that's, yes, Treveon Graham is out. Yes, I got that right. Whew. All off the top of my head. I still don't like any of them. It's rare you'll find a team with 4 relevant rotation pieces out and not be like, hey, this guy's pretty good. But I'm very, very dubious on the Nets. Thoughts on RHJ? I just don't know how much he's going to play. You think it's worth noting that the last game the Knicks and the Hornets played went into OT? That's true. That game did go into single OT, that one. It's also worth noting that they played fairly close both games. But that game I referenced did have both teams going into overtime, as opposed to one team going into overtime. But that is a fair point. People make a bigger deal out of overtime than they should in general. It ends up being an extra, 5 minutes for guys who are already playing 32. So 15% extra is relevant, but people are almost like, oh, overtime is the nuts. Thoughts on fading Rozier and riding with some other thing? I'll get back to questions in a second. Too many questions. Thoughts on Jared Allen? Yeah, Jared Allen, probably my favorite net to play at price. 6,500 on FanDuel is tolerable, especially if you don't have the $400 to get up to Horford, who I'd probably rather play. $5,500 on DK certainly grabs an upside. One of many centers who are too cheap on Yahoo, where you really have 2 center spots, and tonight is no different, where you can play Allen. They're all too cheap. I like Jared Allen, and had a monster game on top of, added Horford to his dudes I blocked a lot list this year. Had a 40 or 50 fantasy point game against the Celtics earlier this year. These two teams have gotten together at least twice previously. Haven't downloaded any of this earlier today, so I'm a little fuzzy on my details there. But you had a monster D'Angelo Russell game, so I guess we'll start talking about that. Look, at ownership, I can certainly see running him out there in a tournament still if you wanted to. You're going to have, obviously, lots of people paying that price for Kemba. FanDuel is still a shooting guard. DK, where the position supported a little bit more. I can see running D'Angelo Russell. That being said, I'm not a real fan of taking guys going into Boston if I can possibly avoid it, and I can really avoid it tonight. Is there a chance that all these random 5K guys, the Joe Harrises of the world, or the 4K guys and the Rodion Skuruks, randomly bust up and put down a big line against the Celtics here. Sure, but there's a chance that like almost nobody is good. Here I have these. I actually had downloaded, so I can look at these real quick. Here's some box scores of the Nets versus the Celtics this year. Just give you an idea of what wouldn't surprise me. Here's a game. Shabazz Napier had 29. That's pretty good. Kurucs had 29. That's pretty good. Jared Allen had 23 in this one. D'Angelo Russell had 11 in 23 minutes. So this must not be the game I was remembering. Kenneth Reed had 35 off the bench, 19 for Dinwiddie off the bench, 26 for Ed Davis. So you really probably wanted no one. No one on that night was in your best possible lineup. I have a pretty strong feeling. Next game, Jared Allen 47 and D'Angelo Russell 56. This is obviously the one I was remembering. DeMarre Carroll had 34, 28 out of Joe Harris, 30 out of Kurucs, 7 out of Trevion Graham, 14 out of Dinwiddie, 14 out of Ed Davis. So, there is no one for whom this looks like a brilliant matchup. We like having so many guys out. You can feel a little better in the minutes, but rather than really solidifying, we just end up dumping minutes onto Theo Pinson, who will crack the rotation tonight. Anyhow, if I was going to play these guys in a tournament, probably my order of interest would be Allen, Russell, Napier, DeMarre Carroll, Ed Davis, Rondé, or something. I mean, it is a particularly sticky spot for me. Even with those guys out, the matchup is bad enough, and there's so many other guys just across the ball. I don't want to play any of those random wings and forwards over Marcus Morris or Jason Tatum or Gordon Hayward. Jason Tatum on DK at 5,600. That's an incredibly good price when you take Kyrie out of there, which we've shown radically increases his upside. As a matter of fact, one of the Kyrie absent games was versus the Nets. It was the second of those two games that I was just referring to where Kyrie didn't play. It was the really disappointing Terry Rozier game, which I assume many of you remember. He played 25 minutes and had 20 fantasy points. It was one of the two really disappointing Gordon Hayward games without Kyrie, and one of the two very disappointing Gordon Hayward games against the Nets. I don't think that's apropos of a lot. It's only a sample size of a couple games, and I've rewatched a reasonable quantity of those games recently, and he just stood there. So it's difficult to ascribe it to anything but standing there. I don't think he got locked up by Rodion Skurucs. Like, he just sort of stood there a lot. So I wish I had better analysis for you than that, but I still like Gordon Hayward in tournaments because we've seen it a couple times without Kyrie, and I can't say I'd be shocked if he randomly threw up a huge number today, and he's just too cheap. And he costs $5K. You can get 40 today pretty easily. Really wouldn't shock me that much. But in the game we're talking about, Jason Tatum had 55 fantasy points. Jaylen Brown had 37 fantasy points. Brad Wanamaker had 28 off the bench. Those were all the guys of note. Al Horford only played 20 in that game. Marcus Morris only played 24. But Terry Rozier started, played 25, had 20 fantasy points. Yeah. So lots of game log watching there. Just to sort of take it back, I would much rather play the Celtics here, minus a usage monster like Kyrie. Not on a back-to-back. Again, the Nets do play again tomorrow. Then take shots on some of the Nets. So I'll be surprised if more than one or maybe two Nets are good today. And again, I would think you're going to get it out of Jared Allen or a monster game out of D'Angelo Russell, which almost assures that nobody other than those two is going to be good. As far as the Celtics, I'd like to play. It's obviously going to be site dependent. I'll set aside Rozier for him being sort of a known quantity. It's probably Tatum a little bit more than Horford, but I really like both of those guys quite a bit. Great matchup for Horford. I actually like Horford a little more. I'll go Horford then Tatum. After that, probably Morris, Brown, Hayward, Smart, I think. But certainly all in play, and a couple of those guys should be good, 2 or 3. And just the matchup for the Celtics against the Nets is much better than the matchup for the Nets against the Celtics. Not as good as, say, the Clippers or something. So we'll get through the doo-doo game first, the 8 p.m. game between the Nuggets and the Grizzlies. This not a matchup incredibly conducive to fantasy success. The lowest over-under of the game of the day by a pretty significant number, sitting at about 209. Jamal Murray will sit out again. You will get starting point guard, basically. Will Barton, Torrey Craig will likely start again and fill in at the 3. You will get more time out of Monty Morris on the bench. You will get more time out of Malik Beasley on the bench. All right, so the price on Barton has now come up to the fact that in a really shitty matchup and still dealing with some bit of minutes restriction, I don't really want to pay 63 on FanDuel. I really don't want to pay 69 on DK. You can do it. He's a guy who carries an upside. FanDuel obviously far superior, but I would rather play Gary Harris at 4,800 before going there. Millsap at DK at 5,100, makes sense as a tournament play, but again, an environment not wholly conducive to fantasy production, and he's probably looking at around his 24 minutes again. Jokic, the price is way up, and it's not a spot I really like. Several people have pointed out that his last game against Marc Gasol earlier this year, he had a great game, put up some 60 fantasy points. The game before that, when they played this year, this was the third time they played, he had like 20 fantasy points. That was the game where he had like 4 points, but 5 fouls and 6 turnovers, or something like it. A truly dreadful game. It is not a good spot for Nikola Jokic. Now, especially with Kyrie gone, we are largely devoid of spend-up options. And he does, you could get 70 out of Jokic here. I have him projected for about 53. There's a real chance that 53 for your $11,000 is something you want in your best possible matchup, because you're getting any number of 35s and 40s out of, I don't know, pick a guy, your Pat Beverleys and Trey Burks or Bismack Biyombo's or whoever's of the world. So, by all means, feel free to play some Nikola Jokic, but he's not a windmill slam for me. It is not a good spot for either him or Marc Gasol across the way. Beyond that, I would still rather play Monty Morris over Malik Beasley on FanDuel, where they're both $4,100, and I think they're both fine there. Any guy who carries an upside and costs around $4,000 on FanDuel, I'm going to like a lot. Both shooting guard eligible, so you can really stack up those value guards. But I would like Morris a little more than Beasley. I still don't mind Mason Plumlee on DraftKings at $3,900. Any number of ways that works out, and some leverage against a somewhat popular Nikola Jokic there. But again, I'm not concerned if I have no one from this game on my team. It's just a thoroughly not appealing environment as opposed to 2 of the other games and 4 of the other teams where it really are nice. Same thing, looking at the Grizzlies here. Obviously, they're going to have its... I don't know if we have final news on JaMychal Green, but whether he plays or not isn't incredibly relevant. I guess it adds Ivan Robb to a broad pool and a couple things like that. But Garrett Temple won't play. Omri Caspi won't play. Justin Holiday is going to play 36 minutes. Kyle Anderson's going to return from injury. I imagine he plays 20, 24 minutes in his return. That seems like a bridge too far to ask. Marc Gasol isn't nearly as cheap as he was for a while, where we were getting, $6,700 Marc Gasol is really nice. He's back up close to 8K on both of the main sites, like all the other centers. Too cheap on Yahoo, and certainly worth firing a shot at there. Justin Holiday at $3,700, I was a huge fan of for $100 a minute. 4,500, 4,900. Would you prefer Lamb or Hardaway? Lamb would be a better cash play to me, pretty significantly. But I would probably prefer Hardaway in a tournament. I'm not sure where the ownership is going to land on those guys. I think Lamb will be higher owned, but that's an interesting question. Pat Bev or Trey Burke in Yahoo Cash? That's a really close question. I know Burke is 12 there. I can't remember what Pat Beverly costs. I will take a look. RHJ starting. All right. I have a little more interest in Rondé Hollis-Jefferson now. Let me review his prices. He's at least a guy who carries his upside. He's 37 on DK. I can get behind that. I can get behind $3,700 Rondé Hollis-Jefferson on DK. I think he probably plays, I'll say 24 to 26 minutes. I think he played 24 in the last game, which again makes everyone else a little bit worse, because again we're just going to hand out minutes nice and smooth like butter. But he's a guy who at least carries an upside in his time, and so I have no interest if you drop him in there. He would rank in the middle of my value plays. I'd like him more than Kevon Looney. I'd like him more than Jordan Bell. I'd like him more than Shelvin Mack. A couple other guys who will get played. I would like him less than Monty Morris, but again, there's a pricing disparity there. So he's 37 there. FanDuel, he's 4,000, but I like him there because he's droppable. Again, so you carry the upside of him picking up some defensive stats and have him available to drop. And again, some of your other cheap value is unlikely to get dropped. So if you're playing Beverly or Rozier or Burke, those are not guys that you're likely to drop. So there's actually an interesting sort of design corollary in that these higher risk guys get better in that situation. because they're more likely to stick, and it's less likely that the drop would hurt you there. But I would now probably rather play Rondé over Kurucs by a little bit. He's a few $100s cheaper than Ed Davis. I'd probably rather give that a shot, but would not be super excited about that. But thank you for updating me with that news. God, I don't want to talk about the ugly game anymore. Let's talk about the last game, which is the greatest game. So, yeah, I like all the Clippers. I'm going to have to be a little better than that. But, so I like Pat Beverly more than Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, even at at the discounted price. You're spending, I think it's $700 and $800 more for Pat Beverly, but he's just been much more active, much more likely to accrue defensive stats. I feel more confident in his minutes. A closer disparity for me is when you're looking at, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or Pat or Avery Bradley. That's pretty close for me. I'm probably still Avery Bradley there, but that I go back and forth on. But I do have Beverly even for whatever it is, $700 more as my favorite of those bargain guys. I was watching in chat before, people were talking about setting restrictions if I don't want more than 2 of Lou Williams, Montrezl Harrell, and Tobias Harris. And I think that's fine, and that's likely to be the case. But I really like them. I really like this game, and they can't all get there. And the reason I know that is because they all got there when these two teams played earlier this year. They played, again, this is an East-West, so they only play twice a year. So this is the second time. The first time you got, I think it was 42 out of Williams, 42 out of Harris, and 50 out of Montrez. So, that wouldn't suck. But, so I don't have it. Now, I think that it's less likely that I think them collectively scoring between the three of them 135 fantasy points is a perfectly reasonable likelihood. The odds on it distributing that evenly, probably not that likely. So I do think having 2 out of the 3 is most likely the best configuration. But I wouldn't be completely indisposed to having all 3 of them land in the same lineup if they should happen to. It is worth pointing out that all of them are dollar per dollar cheaper on FanDuel, where, usually guys are dollar per dollar 10% more or something like that. So getting them all, they are especially well priced on FanDuel. So if I'm building one lineup, I have at least 2 of those 3 players in it on FanDuel. Again, Harris and Harrell and Lou, who we can expect to do a lot of the heavy lifting for this team, most of the heavy lifting for this team. So yeah, beyond that, I like Pat Bev. I like Shai, but I have him after Bradley. So of those 3 guys at their prices, I have them all ranked really closely. Again, I'm curious where our ownership lands. So I'm going to take a look at our ownership. We'll do a little bit of an ownership chat through here for a second. I'm refreshing our DraftKings ownership. You know what? For once, we're going to buck the trend. I'm going to go to FanDuel ownership just because I want to see. FanDuel number 1, Trey Burke, 61%. Number 2, Tobias Harris, 56%. Now, again, FanDuel, that is artificially inflated, or not artificially, but inflated because of the fact that he is a small forward. If he were a power forward, that would get knocked way the hell down. Small forward is a bit of a mess many days, including this day on FanDuel. And the way you know that is number 3 is Kevin Durant at 52%. That's because he's a small forward and you need 2 of them. And with all the good value other places, there's a skill that I really like that's existent on FanDuel, which is how you build like that. And DK doesn't have. You just basically play your best dudes because everyone's multi-positional eligible. But on FanDuel, we have Harris 56, Lou 48, Harrell 47, Beverly 40. So we are agog with those guys. DraftKings, it's a little different. You have 57 Beverly, which is interesting. And then Harris 38, Shai 22, Lou Williams 20, Montrezl Harrell 18. So really interesting how that's affected from one side to the other. And again, these industry best ownership projections only available for your premium Awesemo.com members, or when I randomly read them out on the air. How many Celtics is too many in a DK GPP? I imagine your 4th one is too much at this pace. If you end up with, Horford, Rozier, and Tatum, I think you're just fine. They are priced very nicely there. Let's see, next starting who we expected. Hornets starting who we expected, and then that is Biombo. So again, I kind of like that. Nets are starting Russell, Harris, Kurucs, Hollis Jefferson, and Jared Allen, which makes a lot of sense for me. All right, so let's look at some stuff. I'm loading up my last minute notifications. Let's handle a couple more questions. Hopefully that was all good timing there. Do Hardaway and Barton or Kurucs / RHJ MSG and Lou Will in cash? The second one. I would probably start Lou Will and Kurucs in cash, I think would probably be right there. Hardaway and Barton, both guys I think are great in tournaments, but neither of them very cashy. Lou Will feels a little better. Although the least cashy of those three guys after Harris and Harrell, who I both consider a little more cashy. Horford and Harrell or Vonleh and Boogie. Horford and Harrell for me. How many Celtics is too many? We did that. Tatum and D'Angelo or John Collins and Hardaway. I'd go with John Collins and Hardaway. Durant and Collins or Tobias Harris. I think that's either. Durant, Collins, or Tobias Harris in a DK GPP. Durant, if all else is equal. I do have him projected higher than the other two, and these can be lower owned than so yeah. Thoughts on John Collins on FanDuel? I think he's fine. He's a very reasonable spend up. FanDuel, again, having this positional scarcity adds concepts like just gross points. That's why like Jokic makes a lot more sense on FanDuel. You get one center. DraftKings is a lot of you're playing 8 guys. FanDuel is a lot of you're playing one center. So how do you get the most points at power forward plus center plus small forward, etc.? So John Collins makes plenty of sense on FanDuel. He makes more sense there on DK, actually. DK Cash, Rozier, KD, SGA, or Morris, Lou, and Vonleh. I'll go Rozier, KD, and SGA. Beverly, Burke, Napier, Rank on DK. For raw fantasy points, I have Napier way at the bottom there. You don't have of one of the popular guys there. But for those guys, I have them ranked for just raw points. I have them Burke, Beverly, Napier. Do you like John Collins at all? 32 on Yahoo. I like him most on Yahoo, especially where they're really strict. Where like small forward is a nightmare, and power forward isn't that great. Durant, Gasol, or Jokic, Prince. I'll go Jokic and Prince there. I don't know what that's saying. Let's head over to the... Holy cow. Can Iggy get 35 tonight? I'd say 0.00001% chance. No, it's higher than that. He'll get 35 like 4% chance of the time. But fading Warrior stars could be a nice strategy. Yeah, balanced makes a ton of sense. Or just mostly balanced with a couple guys. Like, you don't need to play 10K guys because they exist. But on DK, they're proportionally a little cheaper. Like, they're priced appropriately. I'm not shocked if you get 60 or 65 out of Steph or Durant. I'm not shocked if they both end between 48 and 54 and aren't necessary. Looking for more of your questions while scanning for news. Trying to do DFS from the game. Hot picture. Am I okay playing Durant and Curry in the same lineup? I'd want to run it back with a pacer or two, but it's not an invalid roster construction. You could have a floor Clay game, which wouldn't shock me. And, Cousins foul trouble or just only play 21 minutes. Or, you could get 110 out of those guys. The Clips could blow out the Hawks or get blown out the other way. So, I don't think it's ideal. I would much rather play one of them than 0 of them. Then 2 of them would be my least favorite of my Steph Durant options, but it's certainly not invalid. We are coming down to it, about 90 seconds, so I'm just going to go into sort of news scanning mode here. Sumner starting, look good. DK minimum price, thoughts. I would rather play Jordan Bell. I like Sumner plenty as a play. I think he plays 23, 24 minutes, and that could work out just fine. But yeah, I would be disinclined towards Sumner relative to some of the other options we have. Rank Harrell, Boogie, and Horford. I have them all projected actually very, very close to each other. Let me take a look here. Harrell, if I don't have the other 2 big Hawks, I'm going to play. If I have the other 2 big Hawks, he probably comes in last for me. And then between Boogie and Horford, I'll probably play Horford for a pile more minutes and not grotesquely over-owned. looking and clicking through for news. Not seeing a whole lot right now. No, it has been an awesome week. As someone who is not allowed to play anymore by statute, by law, by my employer, by FanDuel and DraftKings themselves, nothing makes me happier than seeing, the joy when people hit the life-changing money. I never made more than about $80K in a night. I never made six figures, but I remember the first time I was like, holy shit, I just made a very nice car. Like it is quite a feeling. And seeing people like, oh my god, now my kid has a college fund, and I mean it's truly brilliant. Okay, so yeah, let's do some ownership. We have a couple decent samples for the ownership game on this here evening. Let me get back to that. I'm looking at multiple people at the same time saying that they faded Jokic and how smart they are, and other people saying you're fools for fading Jokic, which both of those are not accurate. He was fine to play, he was fine to fade. If someone was out there saying you had to play Jokic, you're wrong. If someone was out there saying it was stupid to play Jokic, you're wrong. Like, that's just pretty obviously, too. Or at least I would like to hear the argument behind either of those arguments. Alright, so let's look at, looks like there is a 450K Monday night throwdown. Okay, keep going with those crazy toss. Oh, this person played Bismack. They knew what they were doing. 3.2% Bismack Biombo. Let's download this stuff. Let's check out these ownerships. Did we get him right just to the percentage again? I think we did. That's amazing. Man, there's ownership projections. Okay, trying to get... come on now. Alright. Opening our little database here of ownership on DraftKings. And talk about this for a minute, and then I will let you all get on your way for the evening. Highest owned player, I know you're going to be shocked. It is Trey Burke, 62%. That's around the right number. The 80s were crazy high. 62%. I'm thoroughly ambivalent. He's priced very well, but there is a real floor there that he can get to. He's not as bad as, say, a Kobo. The guy's just way too cheap. So, meh. I have no strong take on that. Kevin Durant, 36%. I'd probably want to be under that on DraftKings. There's no reason to fall on that much. I like him. I think he's fine. I'm projected for a touch over 50. That's not so great that I think 37% ownership is good. Cousins, 34%. I'd want to be way under on. I think that's absolutely unnecessary. And that's been right 3 games in a row. So I'm still not sure why people are really all over him at that price with that minutes restriction. But something I don't understand. Steph Curry, 20%. I like that quite a bit more than Kevin Durant at 36%. Darren Collison, 19%. I like it. Klay Thompson, 18%. I don't like it. Kemba Walker, 17%. Yeah, Teddy likes that. Noah Vonleh, 15.4. I like that. Tim Hardaway, 13%. A little higher than I thought. Don't mind that. Domantas Sabonis, 10%. Miles Turner, 5%. Don't quite get that one. I will go with Miles Turner. Jeremy Lamb, 9%. Daddy likes. Nick Batum, 9%. I think Daddy likes that. Bojan, 8.6%. No thank you. Thaddeus Young, 7%. Daddy likes. Jordan Bell, 7%. Fine with that for, again, the flat minimum. Kevon Looney, 6%. No thank you. I mean, Kevon Looney, even if he had been starting, there's, like, you look at Kevon Looney's this year, he's played 35 games without, with Draymond and 15 games without Draymond. In the 15 games without Draymond, he's averaged like an extra minute and a half of time and a fantasy point less. Because when you start and you play aside, 4 of the best 10 players in the league, you don't get a lot of shots. Shocking. Aaron Holiday, 5%. Sure, we haven't gotten to Edmund Sumner yet, so that's going to be fun. There he is. Edmund Sumner, 1.5%. We'll jump ahead. That's kind of fun. I like it. a guy who has a ceiling, but again, Warriors not the spot I particularly want to deploy that, and I do worry about his defense a little bit. He's long, but he's not smart, if that makes sense. From what I've seen. Again, I haven't seen a ton of the guy, but that's from Summer League experience, etc. Kojo, 2.3, that makes sense. Biyombo, 3%, I mentioned. Iguodala, 3.4%. Marvin Williams, 3%. I like him at 3%. Hernan Gomez at 2%. I would rather Biyombo. I think that's a little more likely to get there. Trier, 2%. I like that at 2%. Dotson, 1.75. Okay. Hazonia, 1.6. Okay. Sumner, 1.5. Okay. MKG, 1.25. I like that. Kevin Knox, 1%. Kevin Knox at 1% is the best play on the early slate here for me. I don't know what the odds are he gets there and beats his price significantly. It's better than 1%. Mitch Robinson, 0.66. That might actually be better. I like that quite a bit too. Enes Kanter, 0.61. Oh, the faithful. Tony Parker, 0.42. Malik Monk, 0.29. Draymond Green, 0.19%. Congratulations. You played yourself. I will be back yet again tomorrow alongside somebody. I would have to guess it will be the erstwhile Chris Baggs. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Let's keep the ball rolling. It was a really nice weekend. A lot of nice winnings, and let's keep it going. You have any questions or comments or vitriol, please send them to me via Twitter. I am Fast Eddie Fear. Best of luck in your contest.